The 23rd of January, 1945, 2:17 a.m. Somewhere in the frozen fields near the Western Front. In the dark, men kneel in mud, inflating a tank that weighs less than a few soldiers. A moment later, a deep engine roar rolls across the night, except it isn't an engine. It's a recording, blasted through oversized loudspeakers. Then the radio starts. Crisp, confident traffic that sounds exactly like a real armored unit moving into position. German observers listen, estimate, report, because the battlefield is telling them a story. But what if the story is staged? What if an army can be painted, performed, and broadcast into existence long enough to win? The war that people imagine is steel on steel. Tanks, artillery, infantry lines, casualties measured by the mile. But the war that commanders actually fight is also a contest of perception. Every move has a shadow. Reconnaissance photos, intercepted signals, rumors from civilians, the pattern of noise at night. In that shadow world, deception is not decoration, it is strategy. A fake bridge can protect a real crossing. A phantom division can freeze an enemy corps in place. And in the final stretch of World War II in Europe, the U.S. Army built a unit that treated deception like theater because theater, when done correctly, can be lethal. Officially, it was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Unofficially, it became known as the Ghost Army. About 1,100 men, many recruited for their artistic and technical skills, were organized to do something most armies would never attempt at scale: impersonate major combat units. Not a single trick, not a single inflatable tank for a photo opportunity, but repeated field operations in which deception was the main weapon. They would arrive, set the stage, perform the illusion, and then vanish, leaving the enemy to fire at emptiness while real forces maneuvered elsewhere. Their tools were not mystical. They were practical, methodical, and relentlessly engineered to exploit how humans interpret evidence under stress. The Ghost Army worked through 3 core channels of deception: visual, sonic, and radio, because the enemy rarely relies on just one sense. A tank that looks convincing in daylight is not enough if the night is silent. A loud night is not enough if the radio spectrum is dead. The unit's genius was that it did not sell a single lie. It sold a whole environment. Visual deception was the part people remember. Inflatable tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even aircraft silhouettes, rubber and canvas shaped to look right from a distance, especially from the air. But the real question was always the same: convincing to whom? To a pilot at 8,000 feet? To a reconnaissance plane's camera? To a German patrol peering from a tree line? The Ghost Army didn't need perfection. They needed plausibility at the exact ranges and angles the enemy could realistically observe. That is an art and a science. Sonic deception was the feature that turned props into presence. Large speaker systems could project pre-recorded sounds of armored columns, troop movements, bridge construction, and engine idle layered, timed, and positioned so the night carried the illusion across open ground. The audience was not a crowd in seats. It was enemy intelligence officers trying to reconstruct the battlefield from fragments. A sound here, a light there, a report from a nervous outpost. The Ghost Army understood something timeless. When people are uncertain, they don't wait for perfect information. They commit to a story that feels coherent. Then came radio deception, the most invisible and, in many ways, the most persuasive. Radio operators did not simply transmit random chatter. They mimicked the signature of real units, the rhythm, the habits, the subtle mannerisms that trained listeners could identify. In war, the enemy studies you the way a gambler studies a dealer's hands. If you want to imitate a division, you must imitate its language. The Ghost Army treated radio like a dialect, and the operators like actors who had to become their roles. Put those layers together, and a remarkable thing happens. The enemy doesn't just see a dummy tank. They see a pattern that matches what a real unit would create. The air photos show vehicles. The night carries engines and movement. The radios confirm unit identity. Each piece reinforces the others, and the enemy's mind does the rest, because intelligence work is not a camera. It is interpretation. It is the human need to connect dots into meaning. The strategic context explains why this mattered so much by 1944 and 1945. After the invasion of Normandy and the push across France, Allied operations became a constant battle of timing and position. Rivers had to be crossed. German lines had to be penetrated. Units had to shift without exposing flanks. Every major move created a vulnerable moment when an enemy counterattack could turn momentum into disaster. Deception bought time. Deception created hesitation. And hesitation, in late war Europe, could decide whether a crossing succeeded or whether men died on the banks. The Ghost Army's missions were not glamorous in the traditional sense. They did not take towns. They rarely received credit. Their success was measured in what did not happen. The German artillery that landed on empty fields, the panzer units that rushed to the wrong sector, the enemy commanders who delayed an attack because their map told them the Americans were somewhere they were not. Over more than 20 operations, the unit repeated the same logic with variations. Build a believable fiction so the real force can act without being crushed. Consider the psychological bargain of deception in war. It demands risk. If the enemy sees through the illusion, the performers are suddenly exposed because a deception unit is not built to withstand the full weight of a frontline assault. These men carried weapons and could defend themselves, but their core equipment was not armor, it was time. They needed enough minutes, enough hours, enough uncertainty in the enemy's mind to let the real troops reposition. That meant working close enough to danger that the lie could be observed, and far enough from danger that discovery would not become slaughter. The operations varied by terrain and urgency. In some cases, the Ghost Army staged build-ups where the enemy expected them. They inflated equipment in open areas where aerial reconnaissance would likely pass. They laid tracks in mud to simulate heavy traffic. They parked vehicles in formation patterns that matched standard unit behavior. They controlled lighting at night because a few carefully placed points of light can suggest an entire camp, and when needed, they let civilians see just enough to spread the rumor the enemy wanted to hear. In other cases, their job was to simulate motion, the sense that an armored force was arriving, shifting, preparing to attack. They could create movement with staggered vehicle placement, timed sound projection, and radio activity that rose and fell like a unit's daily rhythm. The point was never merely to convince a single observer. The point was to trigger the enemy's intelligence pipeline, so a report from a patrol matched a blurry aerial image, which matched a radio intercept, which matched the enemy commander's existing fears. That last part is crucial. Deception works best when it aligns with what the enemy already suspects. The Ghost Army did not invent fantasies at random. It played on German expectations where they believed an attack might come from, where they feared a breakthrough, where their own defensive plans made them sensitive. A lie that fits the enemy's mental model is easier to accept than the truth. And in 1945, the German forces in the West were exhausted, stretched, and increasingly forced to make decisions with incomplete information. That is not a weakness of German command alone. It is a universal condition of war. The Ghost Army also exploited a structural reality. In late war Europe, the front lines were dense with units, moving parts, and overlapping responsibilities. A commander might know his immediate sector, but the broader picture was always uncertain. Deception could push that uncertainty over the edge. If the enemy believed 2 American divisions were assembling to the north, he might shift reserves north, leaving the real crossing site thin. If he believed an armored thrust was imminent, he might commit to defensive artillery plans that wasted his best shells on the wrong coordinates. And behind the performance was a discipline that looked less like improvisation and more like project management under fire. Arrive, recon the terrain, determine enemy observation points, choose where to place visual assets for maximum plausibility, coordinate sound projection based on wind, distance, and night conditions. Align radio traffic to match the identity being impersonated. Control the signatures that betray fakes tire tracks, patterns of camp arrangement, even how often a unit would communicate on certain frequencies. A good lie has logistics. The most revealing detail about the Ghost Army is who served in it. These were not typical infantry recruits selected for physical dominance alone. Many were illustrators, graphic artists, architects, designers, and technicians, people trained to think in composition, perspective, and audience. War turned those skills into weapons. A painter understands how a distant shape reads against a horizon. A set designer understands how to imply scale. A sound engineer understands how to place noise, so the brain locates it where you want. This was not a gimmick. It was applied cognition. Their opponents were not fools. German intelligence also practiced deception, camouflage, and signal analysis. The point is not that Germans were easily tricked. The point is that even skilled analysts can be manipulated when multiple data streams reinforce the same conclusion. The Ghost Army's layered approach created that reinforcement. It forced the enemy to choose between two uncomfortable options: ignore the evidence and risk being surprised by a major attack, or accept the evidence and commit defenses to a battle that might not exist. Under pressure, safety often feels like believing the evidence. That is how the trap closes. Over time, the Ghost Army refined its craft. Each mission taught the same harsh lesson: small mistakes can unravel everything. An inflatable tank positioned incorrectly can look wrong in a photo. A soundtrack played too loudly at the wrong time can seem artificial. Radio operators who don't mimic a unit's habits can trigger suspicion in experienced listeners. So the unit learned to treat realism as a system. Every element had to match the story. If the story was an armored division assembling, then the signs of assembly had to appear: vehicle patterns, radio routines, logistical noise, the implied presence of support units. Deception is not the object. Deception is the behavior. Now imagine the stakes as the war approached its final barrier in the West. Germany's river lines and defensive belts. River crossings are nightmares even when uncontested. Under enemy fire, they become a math problem of lives. Engineers build bridges while shells fall. Infantry must secure the far bank. Armor must cross quickly, or the bridgehead collapses. The enemy knows this, so the enemy watches river sectors with obsession. If you can redirect that watch even slightly, you create a window. That window is what the Ghost Army sold. On the eve of a major Allied push, the Ghost Army could be assigned to become an entire formation, an armored force that seemed to be preparing a crossing at one sector, while the real crossing formed elsewhere. In those nights, their work was not abstract. It was brutally immediate. The success of thousands depended on whether German commanders believed the wrong story long enough. If the Germans fired at the illusion had done its job. If the Germans moved reserves toward the Phantom had become real in the only way that mattered. It shaped decisions. The men understood what that meant emotionally. There is a special terror in being a decoy. Traditional soldiers face the risk of battle with the knowledge that their force is built to fight. Decoys face the risk with the knowledge that if the enemy comes close enough, the stage collapses. The Ghost Army's deception had to be observed to work, which meant it could not be staged safely in the rear. These operations lived on the edge of discovery. Yet the unit kept operating, again and again, because late-war Europe demanded constant creative solutions. Commanders needed options that didn't require more bodies. The Ghost Army offered an option that was almost unnatural, turning imagination into maneuver. It is easy to romanticize that, but the truth is more practical and more sobering. Deception does not replace violence. It reallocates it. It pushes the enemy's violence toward the wrong target. It is a way of spending the enemy's ammunition, attention, and time in the least efficient way possible. By early 1945, with German forces increasingly desperate and defensive, the battlefield was also increasingly sensitive to misinformation. German commanders had less fuel, fewer reserves, and shrinking freedom to respond. That made them more reactive to perceived threats, not less. When resources are limited, the cost of being surprised is catastrophic. So the temptation to act on imperfect intelligence becomes stronger. The Ghost Army, knowingly or not, weaponized that desperation. At the operational level, the deception created what planners crave: asymmetry. If one side can force the other to waste effort, the stronger side becomes stronger. A real armored division is expensive in men and materiel. A phantom armored division is comparatively cheap. But if the enemy treats the phantom as real, if he repositions artillery, digs new defenses, delays a counterattack, then the phantom has produced real consequences. This is the hidden arithmetic of the Ghost Army, the ratio between cost and effect. The ultimate point was never to humiliate the enemy. It was to protect the Allied force at its most vulnerable moments. A successful deception could reduce casualties during a bridge operation. It could allow a flank to be reinforced without triggering a German thrust. It could mask a regrouping after a difficult fight. Those outcomes do not appear in dramatic headlines. They appear in survival. They appear in the difference between a crossing held and a crossing lost. And there is another dimension. The Ghost Army was a reminder that modern war is an information war even before the digital age. The tools were analog, rubber, canvas, speakers, radios, but the logic was informational. What does the enemy believe? What evidence does he use? How can that evidence be shaped? The Ghost Army did not hack computers. It hacked perception. It exploited the fact that in war, the enemy's picture is always incomplete, and he must fill the gaps with assumptions. In the last months, as Allied forces pressed deeper and German defense stiffened around key lines, the Ghost Army's work reached a peak of intensity. Their staged build-ups and phantom movements helped create the impression of strength in places where the real strength was about to appear somewhere else. If German commanders shifted units to meet a threat that did not exist, the real threat became easier. If artillery fired at empty fields, the bridge builders worked with fewer shells falling near them. In that sense, every scratchy radio transmission and every muddy track in the wrong field could translate into lives spared in the right place. The night of the deception is always the most dangerous, because it is the moment the enemy might decide to test the story with violence. The Ghost Army sets its stage. Inflatable armor silhouettes aligned to be seen, sound rolling through the dark like approaching columns, radio traffic rising with confident rhythm. Then the enemy reacts. Flares cut through the night. Distant gunfire answers. Artillery begins to hunt coordinates tied to what the enemy believes is massing there. The men in the Ghost Army wait, listening to the rounds land, knowing that every explosion that hits their empty stage is an explosion not hitting the real crossing site, the real infantry, the real engineers. For a few hours, the lie holds. For a few hours, the enemy fights a phantom, and in those hours, the real force moves quietly, decisively into the space the phantom has opened. When the war ended, the Ghost Army's victories were difficult to photograph because they were designed to be unseen. Their record was measured in misdirected fire, delayed reactions, and enemy decisions made with confidence in the wrong map. About 1,100 men artists, technicians, radio specialists, engineers proved that in modern war, the mind is a battlefield as real as any riverbank. The story is not that deception is clever. The story is that deception is consequential. It turns the enemy's certainty into a weapon against him, and it leaves one unsettling question behind. If an army can be manufactured from sound, silhouettes, and radio static, how many battles in history were decided not by force alone, but by the stories commanders believed when they could not see the truth?